We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Nicole Byer, helping you make those rooms flyer. Today's style tip: when it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild! Like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Ooh, fierce! This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
If you work in quality control at a candy factory, you know strict safety regulations come with the job. It's why you partner with Grainger. Grainger helps you find the high-quality and compliant products your business needs to inspect, detect, and help correct issues. And the sweetest part is, everyone gets a product that's as safe to eat as it is delicious. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Chapter 11 of Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. This legamus recording may be distributed and adapted freely for any purpose. Read by a fine voice. Chapter 11. It will never be possible to get a completely accurate and unbiased account of the Barcelona fighting because the necessary records do not exist. Future historians will have nothing to go upon except a mass of accusations and party propaganda. I myself have little data beyond what I saw with my own eyes and what I have learned from other eyewitnesses whom I believe to be reliable. I can, however, contradict some of the more flagrant lies and help to get the affair into some kind of perspective. First of all, what actually happened? For some time past there had been tension throughout Catalonia. In earlier chapters of this book, I have given some account of the struggle between communists and anarchists. By May 1937, things had reached a point at which some kind of violent outbreak could be regarded as inevitable. The immediate cause of friction was the government's order to surrender all private weapons, coinciding with the decision to build up a heavily armed, non-political police force from which trade union members were to be excluded. The meaning of this was obvious to everyone, and it was also obvious that the next move would be the taking over of some of the key industries controlled by the CNT. In addition, there was a certain amount of resentment among the working classes because of the growing contrast of wealth and poverty, and a general vague feeling that the revolution had been sabotaged. Many people were agreeably surprised when there was no rioting on 1st of May. On 3rd of May, the government decided to take over the telephone exchange, which had been operated since the beginning of the war mainly by CNT workers. It was alleged that it was badly run and that official calls were being tapped. Salas, the chief of police, who may or may not have been exceeding his orders, sent 3 lorry loads of armed civil guards to seize the building, while the streets outside were cleared by armed police in civilian clothes. At about the same time, bands of civil guards seized various other buildings in strategic spots. Whatever the real intention may have been, there was a widespread belief that this was the signal for a general attack on the CNT by the civil guards and the PSUC, communists and socialists. The word flew round the town that the workers' buildings were being attacked. Armed anarchists appeared on the streets, work ceased, and fighting broke out immediately. That night and the next morning, barricades were built all over the town, and there was no break in the fighting until the morning of 6th of May. The fighting was, however, mainly defensive on both sides. Buildings were besieged, but, so far as I know, none were stormed, and there was no use of artillery. Roughly speaking, the CNT, FAI, POUM forces held the working-class suburbs, and the armed police forces and the PSUC held the central and official portion of the town. On 6th of May there was an armistice, but fighting soon broke out again, probably because of premature attempts by civil guards to disarm CNT workers. Next morning, however, the people began to leave the barricades of their own accord. Up till roughly the night of 5th of May, the CNT had had the better of it, and large numbers of civil guards had surrendered. But there was no generally accepted leadership and no fixed plan. Indeed, so far as one could judge, no plan at all, except a vague determination to resist the civil guards. The official leaders of the CNT had joined with those of the UGT in imploring everyone to go back to work. Above all, food was running short. In such circumstances, nobody was sure enough of the issue to go on fighting. By the afternoon of 7th of May, conditions were almost normal. That evening, 6,000 assault guards, sent by sea from Valencia, arrived and took control of the town. The government issued an order for the surrender of all arms except those held by the regular forces, and during the next few days, large numbers of arms were seized. The casualties during the fighting were officially given out as 400 killed and about 1,000 wounded. 400 killed is possibly an exaggeration, but as there is no way of verifying this, we must accept it as accurate. Secondly, as to the after effects of the fighting, obviously it is impossible to say with any certainty what these were. There is no evidence that the outbreak had any direct effect upon the course of the war, though obviously it must have had if it continued even a few days longer. It was made the excuse for bringing Catalonia under the direct control of Valencia, for hastening the breakup of the militias and for the suppression of the POUM, and no doubt it also had its share in bringing down the Caballero government. But we may take it as certain that these things would have happened in any case. The real question is whether the CNT workers who came into the street gained or lost by showing fight on this occasion. It is pure guesswork.
Hey, Kristen, how's it tracking?
With Carvana Value Tracker?
What else?
Oh, it's tracking. In fact, Value Surge Alert trucks up 2.5%, vans down 1.7%.
Just as predicted.
Mm-hmm.
So, we gonna...
I don't know. Could sell, could hold.
The power to always know our car's worth.
Exhilarating, isn't it?
Tracking.
Always know your car's worth with Carvana Value Tracker.
If you work in quality control at a candy factory, you know strict safety regulations come with the job. It's why you partner with Grainger. Grainger helps you find the high-quality and compliant products your business needs to inspect, detect, and help correct issues. And the sweetest part is, everyone gets a product that's as safe to eat as it is delicious. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
But my own opinion is that they gained more than they lost. The seizure of the Barcelona telephone exchange was simply one incident in a long process. Since the previous year, direct power had been gradually manoeuvred out of the hands of the syndicates, and the general movement was away from working-class control and towards centralized control, leading on to state capitalism or, possibly, towards the reintroduction of private capitalism. The fact that at this point there was resistance probably slowed the process down. A year after the outbreak of war, the Catalan workers had lost much of their power, but their position was still comparatively favourable. It might have been much less so if they had made it clear that they would lie down under no matter what provocation. There are occasions when it pays better to fight and be beaten than not to fight at all. Thirdly, what purpose, if any, lay behind the outbreak? Was it any kind of coup d'etat or revolutionary attempt? Did it definitely aim at overthrowing the government? Was it preconcerted at all? My own opinion is that the fighting was only preconcerted in the sense that everyone expected it. There were no signs of any very definite plan on either side. On the anarchist side, the action was almost certainly spontaneous, for it was an affair mainly of the rank and file. The people came into the streets and their political leaders followed reluctantly, or did not follow at all. The only people who even talked in a revolutionary strain were the Friends of Durruti, a small extremist group within the FAI and the POUM, but once again they were following and not leading. The Friends of Durruti distributed some kind of revolutionary leaflet, but this did not appear until 5th of May, and cannot be said to have started the fighting, which had started of its own accord 2 days earlier. The official leaders of the CNT disowned the whole affair from the start. There were a number of reasons for this. To begin with, the fact that the CNT was still represented in the government and the Generalité ensured that its leaders would be more conservative than their followers. Secondly, the main object of the CNT leaders was to form an alliance with the UGT, and the fighting was bound to widen the split between CNT and UGT, at any rate for the time being. Thirdly, though this was not generally known at the time, the anarchist leaders feared that if things went beyond a certain point, and the workers took possession of the town, as they were perhaps in a position to do on 5th of May, there would be foreign intervention. A British cruiser and 2 British destroyers had closed in upon the harbour, and no doubt there were other warships not far away. The English newspapers gave it out that these ships were proceeding to Barcelona to protect British interests, but in fact they made no move to do so. That is, they did not land any men or take off any refugees. There can be no certainty about this, but it was at least inherently likely that the British government, which had not raised a finger to save the Spanish government from Franco, would intervene quickly enough to save it from its own working class. The POUM leaders did not disown the affair. In fact, they encouraged their followers to remain at the barricades, and even gave their approval, in La Battaglia, 6th of May, to the extremist leaflet issued by the Friends of Durruti. There is great uncertainty about this leaflet, of which no one now seems able to produce a copy. In some of the foreign papers it was described as an inflammatory poster, which was plastered all over the town. There was certainly no such poster. From comparison of various reports, I should say that the leaflet called for 1. The formation of a revolutionary council, junta. 2. The shooting of those responsible for the attack on the telephone exchange. 3. The disarming of the civil guards. There is also some uncertainty as to how far La Battaglia expressed agreement with the leaflet. I myself did not see the leaflet or La Battaglia of that date. The only handbill I saw during the fighting was one issued by the tiny group of Trotskyists, Bolshevik-Leninists, on 4th of May. This merely said, "Everyone to the barricades, general strike of all industries except war industries." In other words, it merely demanded what was happening already. But in reality, the attitude of the POUM leaders was hesitating. They had never been in favour of insurrection until the war against Franco was won. On the other hand, the workers had come into the streets, and the POUM leaders took the rather pedantic Marxist line that when the workers are on the streets, it is the duty of the revolutionary parties to be with them. Hence, in spite of uttering revolutionary slogans about the reawakening of the spirit of 19th of July and so forth, they did their best to limit the workers' action to the defensive. They never, for instance, ordered an attack on any building. They merely ordered their followers to remain on guard and, as I mentioned in the last chapter, not to fire when it could be avoided. La Battaglia also issued instructions that no troops were to leave the front. A recent number of Imprecours states the exact opposite, that La Battaglia orders the POUM troops to leave the front. The point can easily be settled by referring to La Battaglia of the date named. As far as one can estimate it, I should say that the responsibility of the POUM amounts to having urged everyone to remain at the barricades, and probably to having persuaded a certain number to remain there longer than they would otherwise have done. Those who were in personal touch with the POUM leaders at the time, I myself was not, have told me that they were in reality dismayed by the whole business, but felt that they had got to associate themselves with it. Afterwards, of course, political capital was made out of it in the usual manner. Gorkin, one of the POUM leaders, even spoke later of the glorious days of May. From the propaganda point of view, this may have been the right line. Certainly the POUM rose somewhat in numbers during the brief period before its suppression. Tactically, it was probably a mistake to give countenance to the leaflet of the Friends of Durruti, which was a very small organisation and normally hostile to the POUM. Considering the general excitement and the things that were being said on both sides, the leaflet did not in effect mean much more than "stay at the barricades," but by seeming to approve of it, while Solidaridad Obrera, the anarchist paper, repudiated it, the POUM leaders made it easy for the communist press to say afterwards that the fighting was a kind of insurrection engineered solely by the POUM. However, we may be certain that the communist press would have said this in any case. It was nothing compared with the accusations that were made both before and afterwards on less evidence. The CNT leaders did not gain much by their more cautious attitude. They were praised for their loyalty but were levered out of both the government and the Généralité as soon as the opportunity arose. So far as one could judge from what people were saying at the time, there was no real revolutionary intention anywhere. The people behind the barricades were ordinary CNT workers, probably with a sprinkling of UGT workers among them, and what they were attempting was not to overthrow the government, but to resist what they regarded, rightly or wrongly, as an attack by the police. Their action was essentially defensive, and I doubt whether it should be described, as it was in nearly all the foreign newspapers, as a rising. A rising implies aggressive action and a definite plan. More exactly, it was a riot, a very bloody riot, because both sides had firearms in their hands and were willing to use them. But what about the intentions on the other side? If it was not an anarchist coup d'etat, was it perhaps a communist coup d'etat, a planned effort to smash the power of the CNT at one blow? I do not believe it was, though certain things might lead one to suspect it. It is significant that something very similar, seizure of the telephone exchange by armed police acting under orders from Barcelona, happened in Tarragona 2 days later. And in Barcelona, the raid on the telephone exchange was not an isolated act. In various parts of the town, bands of civil guards and PSUC adherents seized buildings in strategic spots, if not actually before the fighting started, at any rate with surprising promptitude. But what one has got to remember is that these things were happening in Spain and not in England. Barcelona is a town with a long history of street fighting. In such places things happen quickly. The factions are ready-made. Everyone knows the local geography, and when the guns begin to shoot, people take their places almost as in a fire drill. Presumably those responsible for the seizure of the telephone exchange expected trouble, though not on the scale that actually happened, and had made ready to meet it. But it does not follow that they were planning a general attack on the CNT. There are 2 reasons why I do not believe that either side had made preparations for large-scale fighting. 1. Neither side had brought troops to Barcelona beforehand. The fighting was only between those who were in Barcelona already, mainly civilians and police. 2. The food ran short almost immediately. Anyone who has served in Spain knows that the one operation of war that Spaniards really perform really well is that of feeding their troops. It is most unlikely that if either side had contemplated a week or 2 of street fighting and a general strike, they would not have stored food beforehand. Finally, as to the rights and wrongs of the affair. A tremendous dust was kicked up in the foreign anti-fascist press, but as usual, only one side of the case has had anything like a hearing. As a result, the Barcelona fighting has been represented as an insurrection by disloyal anarchists and Trotskyists who were stabbing the Spanish government in the back and so forth. The issue was not quite so simple as that. Undoubtedly, when you are at war with a deadly enemy, it is better not to begin fighting among yourselves, but it is worth remembering that it takes 2 to make a quarrel, and that people do not begin building barricades unless they have received something that they regard as a provocation. The trouble sprang naturally out of the government's order to the anarchists to surrender their arms. In the English press, this was translated into English terms and took this form, that arms were desperately needed on the Aragon front and could not be sent there because the unpatriotic anarchists were holding them back. To put it like this is to ignore the conditions actually existing in Spain. Everyone knew that both the anarchists and the PSUC were hoarding arms, and when the fighting broke out in Barcelona, this was made clearer still. Both sides produced arms in abundance. The anarchists were well aware that even if they surrendered their arms, the PSUC, politically the main power in Catalonia, would still retain theirs, and this in fact was what happened after the fighting was over. Meanwhile, actually visible on the streets, there were quantities of arms which would have been very welcome at the front, but which were being retained for the non-political police forces in the rear. And underneath this, there was the irreconcilable difference between communists and anarchists, which was bound to lead to some kind of struggle sooner or later. Since the beginning of the war, the Spanish Communist Party had grown enormously in numbers and captured most of the political power, and there had come into Spain thousands of foreign communists, many of whom were openly expressing their intention of liquidating anarchism as soon as the war against Franco was won. In the circumstances, one could hardly expect the anarchists to hand over the weapons which they had got possession of in the summer of 1936. The seizure of the telephone exchange was simply the match that fired an already existing bomb. It is perhaps just conceivable that those responsible imagined that it would not lead to trouble. Companyi, the Catalan president, is said to have declared laughingly a few days earlier that the anarchists would put up with anything. New Statesman, 14th of May. But certainly, it was not a wise action. For months past there had been a long series of armed clashes between communists and anarchists in various parts of Spain. Catalonia, and especially Barcelona, was in a state of tension that had already led to street affrays, assassinations and so forth. Suddenly the news ran round the city that armed men were attacking the buildings that the workers had captured in the July fighting, and to which they attached great sentimental importance. One must remember that the civil guards were not loved by the working class population. For generations past, La Guardia had been simply an appendage of the landlord and the boss, and the civil guards were doubly hated because they were suspected, quite justly, of being of very doubtful loyalty against the fascists. At the outbreak of war, the civil guards had everywhere sided with the stronger party. On several occasions later in the war, e.g. at Santander, the local civil guards went over to the fascists in a body. It is probable that the emotion that brought people into the streets in the first few hours was much the same emotion as had led them to resist the rebel generals at the beginning of the war. Of course, it is arguable that the CNT workers ought to have handed over the telephone exchange without protest. One's opinion here will be governed by one's attitude on the question of centralized government and working class control. More relevantly, it may be said, yes, very likely the CNT had a case, but after all there was a war on, and they had no business to start a fight behind the lines. Here I agree entirely. Any internal disorder was likely to aid Franco, but what actually precipitated the fighting? The government may or may not have had the right to seize the telephone exchange. The point is that in the actual circumstances it was bound to lead to a fight. It was a provocative action, a gesture which said in effect, and presumably was meant to say, your power is at an end, we are taking over. It was not common sense to expect anything but resistance. If one keeps a sense of proportion, one must realize that the fault could not be in a matter of this kind, entirely on one side. The reason why a one-sided version has been accepted is simply that the Spanish revolutionary parties have no footing in the foreign press. In the English press in particular, you would have to search for a long time before finding any favourable reference, at any period of the war, to the Spanish anarchists. They have been systematically denigrated, and, as I know by my own experience, it is almost impossible to get anyone to print anything in their defence. I have tried to write objectively about the Barcelona fighting, though. Obviously, no one can be completely objective on a question of this kind. One is practically obliged to take sides, and it must be clear enough which side I am on. Again, I must inevitably have made mistakes of fact, not only here but in other parts of this narrative. It is very difficult to write accurately about the Spanish War because of the lack of non-propagandist documents. I warn everyone against my bias, and I warn everyone against my mistakes. Still, I have done my best to be honest. But it will be seen that the account I have given is completely different from that which appeared in the foreign, and especially the communist press. It is necessary to examine the communist version, because it was published all over the world, has been supplemented at short intervals ever since, and is probably the most widely accepted one. In the communist and pro-communist press, the entire blame for the Barcelona fighting was laid upon the POUM. The affair was represented not as a spontaneous outbreak, but as a deliberate planned insurrection against the government, engineered solely by the POUM, with the aid of a few misguided uncontrollables. More than this, it was definitely a fascist plot, carried out under fascist orders with the idea of starting civil war in the rear and thus paralysing the government. The POUM was Franco's fifth column, a Trotskyist organisation working in league with the fascists. According to the Daily Worker, 11th of May, the German and Italian agents who poured into Barcelona ostensibly to prepare the notorious Congress of the Fourth International had one big task. It was this. They were, in cooperation with the local Trotskyists, to prepare a situation of disorder and bloodshed, in which it would be possible for the Germans and Italians to declare that they were unable to exercise naval control of the Catalan coasts effectively, because of the disorder prevailing in Barcelona, and were therefore unable to do otherwise than land forces in Barcelona. In other words, what was being prepared was a situation in which the German and Italian governments could land troops or marines quite openly on the Catalan coasts, declaring that they were doing so in order to preserve order. The instrument for all this lay ready to hand for the Germans and Italians in the shape of the Trotskyist organisation known as the POUM. The POUM, acting in cooperation with well-known criminal elements and with certain other deluded persons in the anarchist organisations, planned, organised and led the attack in the rearguard, accurately timed to coincide with the attack on the front at Bilbao, etc., etc. Later in the article, the Barcelona fighting becomes the POUM attack, and in another article in the same issue, it is stated that there is no doubt that this is at the door of the POUM, that the responsibility for the bloodshed in Catalonia must be laid. Imprecore, 29th of May, states that those who erected the barricades in Barcelona were only members of the POUM, organised from that party for this purpose. I could quote a great deal more, but this is clear enough. The POUM was wholly responsible, and the POUM was acting under fascist orders. In a moment I will give some more extracts from the accounts that appeared in the communist press. It will be seen that they are so self-contradictory as to be completely worthless. But before doing so, it is worth pointing to several a priori reasons why this version of the May fighting as a fascist rising, engineered by the POUM, is next door to incredible. 1. The POUM had not the numbers or influence to provoke disorders of this magnitude. Still less had it the power to call a general strike. It was a political organisation with no very definite footing in the trade unions. And it would have been hardly more capable of producing a strike throughout Barcelona than, say, the English Communist Party would be of producing a general strike throughout Glasgow. As I said earlier, the attitude of the POUM leaders may have helped to prolong the fighting to some extent, but they could not have originated it even if they had wanted to. 2. The alleged fascist plot rests on bare assertion, and all the evidence points in the other direction. We are told that the plan was for the German and Italian governments to land troops in Catalonia, but no German or Italian troopships approached the coast. As to the Congress of the Fourth International and the German and Italian agents, they are pure myth. So far as I know, there had not even been any talk of a Congress of the Fourth International. There were vague plans for a Congress of the POUM and its brother parties, English ILP, German SAP, etc., etc. This had been tentatively fixed for some time in July, 2 months later, and not a single delegate had yet arrived. The German and Italian agents have no existence outside the pages of the Daily Worker. Anyone who crossed the frontier at that time knows that it was not so easy to pour into Spain, or out of it for that matter. 3. Nothing happened either at Lerida, the chief stronghold of the POUM, or at the front. It is obvious that if the POUM leaders had wanted to aid the fascists, they would have ordered their militia to walk out of the line and let the fascists through. But nothing of the kind was done or suggested, nor were any extra men brought out of the line beforehand, though it would have been easy enough to smuggle, say, 1,000 or 2,000 men back to Barcelona on various pretexts. And there was no attempt even at indirect sabotage of the front. The transport of food, munitions, and so forth continued as usual. I verified this by inquiry afterwards. Above all, a planned rising of the kind suggested would have needed months of preparation, subversive propaganda among the militia, and so forth. But there was no sign or rumour of any such thing. The fact that the militia at the front played no part in the rising should be conclusive. If the POUM were really planning a coup d'etat, it is inconceivable that they would not have used the 10,000 or so armed men who were the only striking force they had. It will be clear enough from this that the communist thesis of a POUM rising under fascist orders rests on less than no evidence. I will add a few more extracts from the communist press. The communist accounts of the opening incident, the raid on the telephone exchange, are illuminating. They agree in nothing except in putting the blame on the other side. It is noticeable that in the English communist papers the blame is put first upon the anarchists and only later upon the POUM. There is a fairly obvious reason for this. Not everyone in England has heard of Trotskyism. Whereas every English-speaking person shudders at the name of anarchist, let it once be known that anarchists are implicated and the right atmosphere of prejudice is established. After that, the blame can safely be transferred to the Trotskyists. The Daily Worker begins thus, 6th of May. A minority gang of anarchists on Monday and Tuesday seized and attempted to hold the telephone and telegram buildings and started firing into the street. There is nothing like starting off with a reversal of roles. The Civil Guards attack a building held by the CNT, so the CNT are represented as attacking their own building, attacking themselves in fact. On the other hand, the Daily Worker of 11th of May states, the left Catalan Minister of Public Security, Aiguade, and the United Socialist General Commissar of Public Order, Rodríguez Salas, sent the armed Republican police into the Telefonica building to disarm the employees there, most of them members of CNT unions. This does not seem to agree very well with the first statement. Nevertheless, the Daily Worker contains no admission that the first statement was wrong. The Daily Worker of 11th of May states that the leaflets of the Friends of Durruti, which were disowned by the CNT, appeared on 4th of May and 5th of May during the fighting. Imprecourt, 22nd of May, states that they appeared on 3rd of May before the fighting, and adds that, in view of these facts, the appearance of various leaflets, the police, led by the Prefect of Police in person, occupied the central telephone exchange in the afternoon of 3rd of May. The police were shot at while discharging their duty. This was the signal for the provocateurs to begin shooting affrays all over the city. And here is Imprecourt for 29th of May. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Commissar for Public Security, Comrade Salas, went to the telephone exchange, which on the previous night had been occupied by 50 members of the POUM and various uncontrollable elements. This seems rather curious. The occupation of the telephone exchange by 50 POUM members is what one might call a picturesque circumstance, and one would have expected somebody to notice it at the time. Yet it appears that it was discovered only 3 or 4 weeks later. In another issue of Imprecourt, the 50 POUM members become 50 POUM militiamen. It would be difficult to pack together more contradictions than are contained in these few short passages. At one moment the CNT are attacking the telephone exchange, the next they are being attacked there. A leaflet appears before the seizure of the telephone exchange and is the cause of it, or alternatively appears afterwards and is the result of it. The people in the telephone exchange are alternatively CNT members and POUM members, and so on. And in a still later issue of the Daily Worker, 3rd of June, Mr. J.R. Campbell informs us that the government only seized the telephone exchange because the barricades were already erected. For reasons of space, I have taken only the reports of one incident, but the same discrepancies run all through the accounts in the communist press. In addition, there are various statements which are obviously pure fabrication. Here, for instance, is something quoted by the Daily Worker, 7th of May, and said to have been issued by the Spanish Embassy in Paris. A significant feature of the uprising has been that the old monarchist flag was flown from the balcony of various houses in Barcelona, doubtless in the belief that those who took part in the rising had become masters of the situation. The Daily Worker very probably reprinted this statement in good faith, but those responsible for it at the Spanish Embassy must have been quite deliberately lying. Any Spaniard would understand the internal situation better than that. A monarchist flag in Barcelona? It was the one thing that could have united the warring factions in a moment. Even the communists on the spot were obliged to smile when they read about it. It is the same with the reports in the various communist papers upon the arms supposed to have been used by the POUM during the rising. They would be credible only if one knew nothing whatever of the facts. In the Daily Worker of 17th of May, Mr. Frank Pitcairn states, "There were actually all sorts of arms used by them in the outrage. There were the arms which they have been stealing for months past, and hidden, and there were arms such as tanks, which they stole from the barracks just at the beginning of the rising. It is clear that scores of machine guns and several thousand rifles are still in their possession." Imprecourt, 29th of May, also states, "On 3rd of May, the POUM had at its disposal some dozens of machine guns and several thousand Rhines. On the Plaza de España, the Trotskyists brought into action batteries of 75 guns, which were destined for the front in Aragon, and which the militia had carefully concealed on their premises." Mr. Pitcairn does not tell us how and when it became clear that the POUM possessed scores of machine guns and several thousand rifles. I have given an estimate of the arms which were at 3 of the principal POUM buildings: about 80 rifles, a few bombs, and no machine guns, i.e. about sufficient for the armed guards which, at that time, all the political parties placed on their buildings. It seems strange that afterwards, when the POUM was suppressed and all its buildings seized, these thousands of weapons never came to light, especially the tanks and field guns, which are not the kind of thing that can be hidden up the chimney. But what is revealing in the two statements above is the complete ignorance they display of the local circumstances. According to Mr. Pitcairn, the POUM stole tanks from the barracks. He does not tell us which barracks. The POUM militiamen who were in Barcelona, now comparatively few, as direct recruitment to the party militias had ceased, shared the Lenin barracks with a considerably larger number of Popular Army troops. Mr. Pitcairn is asking us to believe, therefore, that the POUM stole tanks with the connivance of the Popular Army. It is the same with the premises on which the 75mm guns were concealed. There is no mention of where these premises were. Those batteries of guns firing on the Plaza de España appeared in many newspaper reports, but I think we can say with certainty that they never existed. As I mentioned earlier, I heard no artillery fire during the fighting, though the Plaza de España was only a mile or so away. A few days later I examined the Plaza de España and could find no buildings that showed marks of shell fire, and an eyewitness who was in that neighbourhood throughout the fighting declares that no guns ever appeared there. Incidentally, the tale of the stolen guns may have originated with Antonov Ovsenko, the Russian consul general. He at any rate communicated it to a well-known English journalist, who afterwards repeated it in good faith in a weekly paper. Antonov Ovsenko has since been purged. How this would affect his credibility I do not know. The truth is, of course, that these tales about tanks, field guns and so forth have only been invented because otherwise it is difficult to reconcile the scale of the Barcelona fighting with the POUM's small numbers. It was necessary to claim that the POUM was wholly responsible for the fighting. It was also necessary to claim that it was an insignificant party with no following and numbered only a few thousand members, according to Imprecourt. The only hope of making both statements credible was to pretend that the POUM had all the weapons of a modern mechanized army. It is impossible to read through the reports in the communist press without realizing that they are consciously aimed at a public ignorant of the facts and have no other purpose than to work up prejudice. Hence, for instance, such statements as Mr. Pitcairn's in the Daily Worker of 11th of May that the rising was suppressed by the Popular Army. The idea here is to give outsiders the impression that all Catalonia was solid against the Trotskyists, but the Popular Army remained neutral throughout the fighting. Everyone in Barcelona knew this, and it is difficult to believe that Mr. Pitcairn did not know it too. Or again, the juggling in the communist press with the figures for killed and wounded with the object of exaggerating the scale of the disorders. Diaz, General Secretary of the Spanish Communist Party, widely quoted in the communist press, gave the numbers as 900 dead and 2,500 wounded. The Catalan Minister of Propaganda, who was hardly likely to underestimate, gave the numbers as 400 killed and 1,000 wounded. The Communist Party doubles the bid and adds a few more hundreds for luck. The foreign capitalist newspapers, in general, laid the blame for the fighting upon the anarchists. But there were a few that followed the communist line. One of these was the English News Chronicle, whose correspondent, Mr. John Langdon Davis, was in Barcelona at the time I quote portions of his article here. A Trotskyist revolt. This has not been an anarchist uprising. It is a frustrated putsch of the Trotskyist POUM working through their controlled organisations, Friends of Durruti and Libertarian Youth. The tragedy began on Monday afternoon when the government sent armed police into the telephone building to disarm the workers there, mostly CNT men. Grave irregularities in the service had been a scandal for some time. A large crowd gathered in the Plaza de Catalonia outside while the CNT men resisted, retreating floor by floor to the top of the building. The incident was very obscure, but word went round that the government was out against the anarchists. The streets filled with armed men. By nightfall, every workers' centre and government building was barricaded, and at 10 o'clock the first volleys were fired and the first ambulances began ringing their way through the streets. By dawn, all Barcelona was under fire. As the day wore on and the dead mounted to over 100, one could make a guess at what was happening. The anarchist CNT and socialist UGT were not technically out in the street. So long as they remained behind the barricades, they were merely watchfully waiting, an attitude which included the right to shoot at anything, armed in the open street. The general bursts were invariably aggravated by pacos, hidden solitary men, usually fascists, shooting from rooftops at nothing in particular, but doing all they could to add to the general panic. By Wednesday evening, however, it began to be clear who was behind the revolt. All the walls had been plastered with an inflammatory poster calling for an immediate revolution and for the shooting of Republican and Socialist leaders. It was signed by the Friends of Durruti. On Thursday morning, the anarchists daily denied all knowledge or sympathy with it, but La Battaglia, the POUM paper, reprinted the document with the highest praise. Barcelona, the first city of Spain, was plunged into bloodshed by agents provocateurs using this subversive organisation. This does not agree very completely with the communist versions I've quoted above, but it will be seen that even as it stands, it is self-contradictory. First, the affair is described as a Trotskyist revolt. Then it is shown to have resulted from a raid on the telephone building, and the general belief that the government was out against the anarchists. The city is barricaded and both CNT and UGT are behind the barricades. 2 days afterwards, the inflammatory poster, actually a leaflet, appears, and this is declared by implication to have started the whole business. Effect preceding cause. But there is a piece of very serious misrepresentation here. Mr. Langdon Davis describes the Friends of Durruti and Libertarian Youth as controlled organisations of the POUM. Both were anarchist organisations and had no connection with the POUM. The Libertarian Youth was the youth league of the anarchists, corresponding to the JSU of the PSUC, etc. The Friends of Durruti was a small organisation within the FAI and was in general bitterly hostile to the POUM. So far as I can discover, there was no one who was a member of both. It would be about equally true to say that the Socialist League is a controlled organisation of the English Liberal Party. Was Mr. Langdon Davis unaware of this? If he was, he should have written with more caution about this very complex subject. I am not attacking Mr. Langdon Davis's good faith, but admittedly he left Barcelona as soon as the fighting was over, i.e. at the moment when he could have begun serious inquiries, and throughout his report there are clear signs that he has accepted the official version of a Trotskyist revolt without sufficient verification. This is obvious even in the extract I have quoted. By nightfall, the barricades are built, and at 10 o'clock, the first volleys are fired. These are not the words of an eyewitness. From this you would gather that it is usual to wait for your enemy to build a barricade before beginning to shoot at him. The impression given is that some hours elapsed between the building of the barricades and the firing of the first volleys, whereas, naturally, it was the other way about. I and many others saw the first volleys fired early in the afternoon. Again, there are the solitary men, usually fascists, who are shooting from the rooftops. Mr. Langdon Davis does not explain how he knew that these men were fascists. Presumably, he did not climb onto the roofs and ask them. He is simply repeating what he has been told, and, as it fits in with the official version, it is not questioning it. As a matter of fact, he indicates one probable source of much of his information by an incautious reference to the Minister of Propaganda at the beginning of his article. Foreign journalists in Spain were hopelessly at the mercy of the Ministry of Propaganda, though one would think that the very name of this ministry would be a sufficient warning. The Minister of Propaganda was of course about as likely to give an objective account of the Barcelona trouble as, say, the late Lord Carson would have been to give an objective account of the Dublin Rising of 1916. I have given reasons for thinking that the communist version of the Barcelona fighting cannot be taken seriously. In addition, I must say something about the general charge that the POUM was a secret fascist organisation in the pay of Franco and Hitler. This charge was repeated over and over in the communist press, especially from the beginning of 1937 onwards. It was part of the worldwide drive of the official Communist Party against Trotskyism, of which the POUM was supposed to be representative in Spain. Trotskyism, according to Frente Rojo, the Valencia communist paper, is not a political doctrine. Trotskyism is an official capitalist organisation, a fascist terrorist hand occupied in crime and sabotage against the people. The POUM was a Trotskyist organisation in league with the fascists and part of Franco's fifth column. What was noticeable from the start was that no evidence was produced in support of this accusation. The thing was simply asserted with an air of authority, and the attack was made with the maximum of personal libel and with complete irresponsibility as to any effects it might have upon the war. Compared with the job of libelling the POUM, many communist writers appear to have considered the betrayal of military secrets unimportant. In a February number of the Daily Worker, for instance, a writer, Winifred Bates, is allowed to state that the POUM had only half as many troops on its section of the front as it pretended. This was not true, but presumably the writer believed it to be true. She and the Daily Worker were perfectly willing, therefore, to hand to the enemy one of the most important pieces of information that can be handed through the columns of a newspaper. In the New Republic, Mr. Ralph Bates stated that the POUM troops were playing football with the fascists in no man's land at a time when, as a matter of fact, the POUM troops were suffering heavy casualties, and a number of my personal friends were killed and wounded. Again, there was the malignant cartoon which was widely circulated, first in Madrid and later in Barcelona, representing the POUM as slipping off a mask marked with the hammer and sickle and revealing a face marked with the swastika. Had the government not been virtually under communist control, it would never have permitted a thing of this kind to be circulated in wartime. It was a deliberate blow at the morale not only of the POUM militia, but of any others who happened to be near them. For it is not encouraging to be told that the troops next to you in the line are traitors. As a matter of fact, I doubt whether the abuse that was heaped upon them from the rear actually had the effect of demoralising the POUM militia. but certainly it was calculated to do so, and those responsible for it must be held to have put political spite before anti-fascist unity. The accusation against the POUM amounted to this, that a body of some scores of thousands of people, almost entirely working class, besides numerous foreign helpers and sympathisers, mostly refugees from fascist countries, and thousands of militia, was simply a vast spying organisation in fascist pay, and not the rank and file. But this was merely an attempt to detach the rank and file from their leaders. The nature of the accusation implied that ordinary members, militiamen and so forth, were all in the plot together. For it was obvious that if Nin, Gorkin and the others were really in fascist pay, it was more likely to be known to their followers, who were in contact with them, than to journalists in London, Paris and New York. And in any case, when the POUM was suppressed, the communist-controlled secret police acted on the assumption that all were guilty alike and arrested everyone connected with the POUM whom they could lay hands on, including even wounded men, hospital nurses, wives of POUM members, and in some cases even children. Finally, on 15th to 16th of June, the POUM was suppressed and declared an illegal organisation. This was one of the first acts of the Negrin government, which came into office in May. When the executive committee of the POUM had been thrown into jail, the communist press produced what purported to be the discovery of an enormous fascist plot. For a while, the communist press of the whole world was flaming with this kind of thing. Daily Worker, 21st of June, summarising various Spanish communist papers. Spanish Trotskyists plot with Franco. Following the arrest of a large number of leading Trotskyists in Barcelona and elsewhere, there became known, over the weekend, details of one of the most ghastly pieces of espionage ever known in wartime, and the ugliest revelation of Trotskyist treachery to date. Documents in the possession of the police, together with the full confession of no less than 200 persons under arrest, prove, etc., etc. What these revelations proved was that the POUM leaders were transmitting military secrets to General Franco by radio, were in touch with Berlin and were acting in collaboration with the secret fascist organisation in Madrid. In addition, there were sensational details about secret messages in invisible ink, a mysterious document signed with the letter N, standing for Nin, and so on and so forth. But the final upshot was this. 6 months after the event, as I write, most of the POUM leaders are still in jail, but they have never been brought to trial, and the charges of communicating with Franco by radio, etc., have never even been formulated. Had they really been guilty of espionage, they would have been tried and shot in a week, as so many fascist spies had been previously. But not a scrap of evidence was ever produced, except the unsupported statements in the communist press. As for the 200 full confessions, which, if they had existed, would have been enough to convict anybody, they have never been heard of again. They were, in fact, 200 efforts of somebody's imagination. More than this, most of the members of the Spanish government have disclaimed all belief in the charges against the POUM. Recently, the cabinet decided by 5-2 in favour of releasing anti-fascist political prisoners, the two dissentients being the communist ministers. In August, an international delegation headed by James Maxton MP went to Spain to inquire into the charges against the POUM and the disappearance of Andrés Nin. Prieto, the Minister of National Defence, Irujo, the Minister of Justice, Zugazagotia, Minister of the Interior, Ortega y Gasset, the Procurer General, Prat Garcia, and others all repudiated any belief in the POUM leaders being guilty of espionage. Irujo added that he had been through the dossier of the case, that none of the so-called pieces of evidence would bear examination, and that the document supposed to have been signed by Nin was valueless, i.e. a forgery. Prieto considered the POUM leaders to be responsible for the May fighting in Barcelona, but dismissed the idea of their being fascist spies. What is most grave, he added, is that the arrest of the POUM leaders was not decided upon by the government, and the police carried out these arrests on their own authority. Those responsible are not the heads of the police, but their entourage, which has been infiltrated by the communists according to their usual custom. He cited other cases of illegal arrests by the police. Irujo likewise declared that the police had become quasi-independent and were in reality under the control of foreign communist elements. Prieto hinted fairly broadly to the delegation that the government could not afford to offend the Communist Party while the Russians were supplying arms. When another delegation headed by John McGovern MP went to Spain in December, they got much the same answers as before. And Zugo Zagoitia, the Minister of the Interior, repeated Prieto's hint in even plainer terms. We have received aid from Russia and have had to permit certain actions which we did not like. As an illustration of the autonomy of the police, it is interesting to learn that even with a signed order from the Director of Prisons and the Ministry of Justice, McGovern and the others could not obtain admission to one of the secret prisons maintained by the Communist Party in Barcelona. For reports on the two delegations, see Le Populaire, 7th of September, La Leche, 18th of September, report on the Maxton delegation published by Independent News, 219 Rue Saint-Denis, Paris, and McGovern's pamphlet terror in Spain. I think this should be enough to make the matter clear. The accusation of espionage against the POUM rested solely upon articles in the communist press and the activities of the communist-controlled secret police. The POUM leaders and hundreds or thousands of their followers are still in prison, and for 6 months past the communist press has continued to clamour for the execution of the traitors. But Negrin and the others have kept their heads and refused to stage a wholesale massacre of Trotskyists. Considering the pressure that has been put upon them, it is greatly to their credit that they have done so. Meanwhile, in face of what I have quoted above, it becomes very difficult to believe that the POUM was really a fascist spying organisation, unless one also believes that Maxton, McGovern, Prieto, Irujo, Zugazagoitia and the rest are all in fascist pay together. Finally, as to the charge that the POUM was Trotskyist, this word is now flung about with greater and greater freedom, and it is used in a way that is extremely misleading, and is often intended to mislead. It is worth stopping to define it. The word Trotskyist is used to mean 3 distinct things. 1. One who, like Trotsky, advocates world revolution as against socialism in a single country. More loosely, a revolutionary extremist. 2. A member of the actual organisation of which Trotsky is head. 3. A disguised fascist posing as a revolutionary who acts especially by sabotage in the USSR, but in general by splitting and undermining the left-wing forces. In sense 1, the POUM could probably be described as Trotskyist. So can the English ILP, the German SAP, the left socialists in France, and so on. But the POUM had no connection with Trotsky or the Trotskyist Bolshevik-Leninist organisation. When the war broke out, the foreign Trotskyists who came to Spain, 15 or 20 in number, worked at first for the POUM as the party nearest to their own viewpoint, but without becoming party members. Later, Trotsky ordered his followers to attack the POUM policy, and the Trotskyists were purged from the party offices, though a few remained in the militia. Nin, the POUM leader, after Moran's capture by the fascists, was at one time Trotsky's secretary, but had left him some years earlier and formed the POUM by the amalgamation of various opposition communists with an earlier party, the Workers' and Peasants' Bloc. Nin's one-time association with Trotsky has been used in the communist press to show that the POUM was really Trotskyist. By the same line of argument, it could be shown that the English Communist Party is really a fascist organisation because of Mr. John Strachey's one-time association with Sir Oswald Mosley. In sense, too, the only exactly defined sense of the word, the POUM was certainly not Trotskyist. It is important to make this distinction because it is taken for granted by the majority of communists that a Trotskyist, in sense 2, is invariably a Trotskyist in sense 3, i.e. that the whole Trotskyist organization is simply a fascist spying machine. Trotskyism only came into public notice in the time of the Russian sabotage trials, and to call a man a Trotskyist is practically equivalent to calling him a murderer, agent provocateur, etc. But at the same time, anyone who criticizes communist policy from a left-wing standpoint is liable to be denounced as a Trotskyist. Is it then asserted that everyone professing revolutionary extremism is in fascist pay? In practice, it is or is not, according to local convenience. When Maxton went to Spain with the delegation, I have mentioned above Verdad, Frente Rojo, and other Spanish communist papers instantly denounced him as a Trotskyist fascist, spy of the Gestapo, and so forth. Yet the English communists were careful not to repeat this accusation. In the English communist press, Maxton becomes merely a reactionary enemy of the working class, which is conveniently vague. The reason, of course, is simply that several sharp lessons have given the English communist press a wholesome dread of the law of libel. The fact that the accusation was not repeated in a country where it might have to be proved is sufficient confession that it is a lie. It may seem that I have discussed the accusations against the POUM at greater length than was necessary. Compared with the huge miseries of a civil war, this kind of internecine squabble between parties, with its inevitable injustices and false accusations, may appear trivial. It is not really so. I believe that libels and press campaigns of this kind, and the habits of mind they indicate, are capable of doing the most deadly damage to the anti-fascist cause. Anyone who has given the subject a glance knows that the communist tactic of dealing with political opponents by means of trumped-up accusations is nothing new. Today the key word is Trotsky fascist. Yesterday it was social fascist. It is only 6 or 7 years since the Russian state trials proved that the leaders of the Second International, including, for instance, Leon Blum and prominent members of the British Labour Party, were hatching a huge plot for the military invasion of the USSR. Yet today the French communists are glad enough to accept Blum as a leader, and the English communists are raising heaven and earth to get inside the Labour Party. I doubt whether this kind of thing pays, even from a sectarian point of view. And meanwhile there is no possible doubt about the hatred and dissension that the Trotsky fascist accusation is causing. Rank-and-file communists everywhere are led away on a senseless witch hunt after Trotskyists, and parties of the type of the POUM are driven back into the terribly sterile position of being mere anti-communist parties. There is already the beginning of a dangerous split in the world working class movement. A few more libels against lifelong socialists, a few more frame-ups like the charges against the POUM, and the split may become irreconcilable. The only hope is to keep political controversy on a plane where exhaustive discussions is possible. Between the communists and those who stand or claim to stand to the left of them, there is a real difference. The communists hold that fascism can be beaten by alliance with sections of the capitalist class, the Popular Front. Their opponents hold that this manoeuvre simply gives fascism new breeding grounds. The question has got to be settled. To make the wrong decision may be to land ourselves in for centuries of semi-slavery. But so long as no argument is produced except a scream of Trotsky fascist, the discussion cannot even begin. It would be impossible for me, for instance, to debate the rights and wrongs of the Barcelona fighting with a Communist Party member, because no communist, that is to say no good communist, could admit that I have given a truthful account of the facts. If he followed his party line dutifully, he would have to declare that I am lying, or, at best, that I am hopelessly misled, and that anyone who glanced at the Daily Worker headlines 1,000 miles from the scene of events knows more of what was happening in Barcelona than I do. In such circumstances there can be no argument. The necessary minimum of agreement cannot be reached. What purpose is served by saying that men like Maxton are in fascist pay? Only the purpose of making serious discussion impossible. It is as though in the middle of a chess tournament, one competitor should suddenly begin screaming that the other is guilty of arson or bigamy. The point that is really at issue remains untouched. Libel settles nothing. End of chapter 11.